Hey everybody, what's up? Good evening. Welcome to another edition here of Grinders Live College Football After Dark. And boy, what a Thursday we've got in store for you here today. I mean, it's been great programming. We've had hockey, we've had NBA, we've had NFL, and now it's time to talk about the college game. And right here on rotogrinders.com, 4 hours of live daily fantasy talk. I love it. Really happy to be able to bring this to you each and every week. Again, I am Dan Bach. I will be joined by the one and only Head Shopper here momentarily. And for the next hour, we'll be talking daily fantasy college football with you. And, we got a great night of sports going right now. You've got, Florida State playing. You've got Thursday Night Football about to get started. LeBron makes his debut, so absolutely loaded up with good stuff. So we're going to jump right into it. I think we're going to do things a bit differently. I think we're going to go early slate. Yeah, I know. You're surprised there, Shop, aren't you?
I didn't get that memo.
Well, we're going to go early slate and late slate. So we're going to just go through a little bit faster. And because you know what? I don't know. I wasn't really a super big fan of it at first, but I've come around on the dual slates because sometimes I get overwhelmed with too many games in a player or in a pool, and I kind of it feels like having 2 days in one here with college football. So it's kind of like you before. I know you're not a huge fan of it, but I've come around on it and like it. But a few things we need to let you know about King of the Campus, Super King of the Campus, or something like that on FanDuel. They're running a $100,000 tournament in a few weeks. I think it's a Super Hail Mary is the term. And the King of the Campus, of course, is their big bowl season tournament. But Super Hail Mary in a couple weeks. We've got a free roll for you. They're giving away 10 tickets to that tournament right there in the Grinders Forum. Just click on that pinned post by Dillinger, and you can enter that absolutely free. And it's exclusive for you Grinder members. So it's going to be a smaller field than your typical free roll you see over there on FanDuel. So no reason not to throw a lineup in that. Also, again, DraftKings next week is their big game, they're calling it, and that's another $100,000 tournament, and that's a $27 buy-in. You're going to see a lot of satellite qualifiers for this and the other tournaments on FanDuel. Take advantage of them. It's a good way to get in, get multiple entries, and in college football it's really useful to kind of get exposure because there's so many different lineup combinations you can go with. So definitely wanted to mention that here today. All right, Chop, let's get to it real quick. Forget about the over-unders. We'll talk about those when we get to them. Let's kind of start with quarterbacks in the early slate. And I don't know about you, but I kind of wish some of these stud quarterbacks in the late slate would have been in the early slate because there's about 6, 7 guys that really stand out in the evening session, the early session, not nearly as many. So who do you like in this early set?
My number one guy on the board for the early slate is going to be Bryce Petty, and he's costly, but this is one of these games. Baylor got beat by West Virginia. They really practically got embarrassed last time out, and they've had a week to lick their wounds. And this just feels like, I wrote it up in my column. This feels like a 70-point game for Baylor, and I guarantee you Petty will have a lot to do with that. So as far as high floor with a nice ceiling, also Petty's my number one guy. Right below him on that is another high-priced guy. We're talking about the big guys now. That's Shane Carden. This is shaping up to be a good game for him too, because I think Temple has enough offense to keep it close, and he puts up some monster numbers somehow, like on the ground and through the air. So he's got that dual threat thing going on, and he's real sneaky about it. But I like Carden, and there's a guy who's just right at the same price tag as him, he might be the best quarterback in the nation that nobody ever talks about, it, Trevon Boykin. And I remember a few weeks ago his price was in the $6,400 range on FanDuel. Now he's up to $9,800. But even now at this price, he's still, you could make a claim to say he's worth it at this price. Last week, wow, what a monster game last week, and he's done it practically every game this year, minus maybe a really tough road game. He got stifled at Baylor when the special teams did all the heavy lifting. And other than that, he's been spot on. Those are the studs in that opening slate to me. And there's a couple value plays down there.
Yeah, we'll get to those in a moment. I'm with you on Petty. I really like him too, and I think that's something that we need to not neglect is you've got a lot of one-loss teams here, like Baylor, like Actually, all the quarterbacks you just mentioned, Boykin, Carden, they're all playing for one-loss teams. And I think that it's important to note that, they're going to have to win with style points. And we saw it last week with TCU. So I think that you're going to see these teams put up some really big numbers, not let off that accelerator at all, and just kind of destroy these opponents, because it's going to be a tough decision, which one-loss team you want to take or the committee wants to take. So I certainly would think that you're going to see these guys put the pedal to the metal, and all three of them are definitely in play. Now, the salary caps are tightening up a little bit, but I agree with you. Petty, number one for me. I think Boykin over Carden on the road at Temple. Carden should be okay, but not as excited about it. Boykin, a really high total game there with West Virginia. Now, there's big news that just hit a few hours before our show, and that's that Kenny Hill is not going to start for Texas A&M. It's supposed to be Kyle Allen this week. Now, you're a Texas guy, Chop. What's the lowdown on Allen? I know he's mega cheap in the industry. I think min salary on both FanDuel and DraftKings, and honestly, against Louisiana Monroe, it's tough to not play him this week. I think he's a borderline must-play in both cash and tournaments. And I know it's crazy to take a cheap guy in cash like that, but this guy, as far as I know, is a pretty big prospect, and they are huge favorites here. So thoughts on Kyle Allen?
He's a good quarterback, but he is really young. I believe he's a true freshman. But, he has a good pedigree coming out of high school. I was stunned and shocked when I heard that news earlier, that they're just giving up on Kenny Hill like that, because that's basically what they're doing, is giving up on him. I'm a little bit surprised. This guy's good. The only reason I say he's a solid play. Definitely GPPs. He opens up cap in cash games. It's a little bit more risky if you got like a lot of money on the line. But, he's still a great play. The only thing that I'm worried about here is that it is a big game. It is a big 33-point spread. Monroe is really bad against the run. We could see a lot of the running game, the running back by committee, who you can't really pin down for one guy in that committee, but they do have a running back by committee. A little bit worried that maybe that thing takes a little bit out of the passing game. But you're right. I don't have a scouting report on him. I just know he's a pretty good prospect out of high school, but he's a young guy.
But he's also, on a team that's supposed to score 49 points. Yeah. And at that salary, you don't need that much, and that suddenly opens up the ability to say, oh, how about these running backs, Melvin Gordon, Abdullah, James Conner, Javorius Allen, Tevin Coleman. It gives you the option to get those guys. If you're playing Bryce Petty, if you take another highfalutin running back like that, you're not going to have much room for anything else. So I think that a lot of people are going to go that route, and I might be one of them. In terms of cash to tournament, probably what I would do in this kind of scenario is probably split my cash. I'd probably use a stud on half of them, a stud QB like a Petty or a Boykin on one half, and then go with the value guy on the other half. Kind of save yourself a little bit, and give your exposure to both sides of it. So that's what I would do, and I think. In NFL and other sports, split and cash games, we don't really recommend it that often. But I think in college football, you definitely can do it.
Yeah, that's what he's a good play. On paper, he should be a good play. But I'm not going to be all in on him, just because you just don't know what the future is going to hold. This game, they may say, and I'm not saying this, but they may say, oh, Kyle Allen started. And then we might split snaps later on in the game. Who knows? So you don't want to load up on one guy. Even if it's Melvin Gordon, I wouldn't go all in on any one particular player, because you just never know about college football. But yeah, on paper, he seems like a fantastic play this week.
All right, let's find some other guys here, kind of mid-range. What's your thoughts on Kaya for Miami going against North Carolina? This defense has been awful. I know we'll touch up on Duke Johnson here, but is Kaya in play for you, the man under center for the Canes? Yeah,
he's one of the guys I was going to mention. He seems like he's got a really good matchup here. He's been pretty good in these games where they're supposed to put up points against weaker competition. It's been pretty darn good. He's got a couple threats to throw to, so I think he's definitely in play, and he's got a nice little salary there, nice low salary. just a mid-range guy. He opens up some things with some other positions. I think he has a chance to have a pretty big game here against this team.
Who do you like better, him or Greg Ward Jr.? He's
Oh, God.
400. He's actually 700 less than Kaya is, but look at the numbers this guy's been putting up, man.
I'd take Kaya, man.
He was 29 for 33 passing against Temple, and can run the ball like crazy. Over 23 fantasy points in his last 2 starts.
I mean, but I've watched Greg Ward Jr. Being a Houston fan, I've watched him for more than just these past 2 starts. I've watched him from the very beginning, and I'm a little, apprehensive on his ability to keep that up. In this particular match, you're asking me about these 2 guys. I'd take Kaya all day long, especially with this matchup at home against UNC. That's just tailor-made for a guy like Kaya.
Okay, where are you going to come out on Michigan this week? I know you hate Devin Gardner. You think he's terrible.
Oh, God, he
but
is,
Indiana
man.
is equally terrible. They're at home. Can he get enough going to make it worthwhile this week?
It's one of these things. I don't know. We'll go back to the Garrett Christage analogy, man, that we made 2 weeks ago. Sometimes the maps they look great on paper, but you don't ever want to force a guy in there. At this point, yikes. There's some guys down there in that range. Kaya's not that much more expensive than Gardner, and Kyle Allen is even cheaper. So I'm not even sure Gardner's going to make it on the team. The matchup looks good, but man, he's just been terrible for about a year and a half now.
I'm going to give you a guy who I really like this week, and I think he's going to be off the radar, and that's Jacoby Brissett for North Carolina State. They take on Syracuse, and he's had really tough matchups the last couple of weeks, and now he gets Syracuse on the road. This is definitely not a very good defense, and I expect him to get back in the mid-20s this week. So I'm going to throw him out there as kind of an off-the-radar, cheap guy that not a lot of people will have. Does it with his arms and his legs to a point, so I like Brissett as my off-the-radar guy. Okay, let's keep moving here because we got 2 slates to hit up. Running back in the early slate is kind of like quarterback in the late slate. You got Abdullah, you got Gordon, you got Allen, you've got Tevin Coleman. Boy, those are the big 4 names this week. How do you rank them?
I'm gonna always be a little partial to Melvin Gordon. I think he's the best guy. But I mean, Abdullah's putting up the best numbers right now. So I mean, personally, you go Gordon and Abdullah, you put their name in a hat and pull one out there. Both capable of going for 200 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's 1A and 1A. Tevin Coleman, the matchup is slightly more difficult than I would want to. For that kind of price tag. Michigan, I know they got ran on last week by Michigan State, but that's a different kind of a running style. Coleman's more of a guy who kind of creates things on his own, whereas Michigan State just got that big offensive line and they pound and wear down. I'm a little bit worried about Coleman, but he's been so good though so far that it's hard to keep him off of that top 5 list. James Conner has a good matchup. I like where that one's going against Duke. It's at home. Last week, he put up a good game last week. Could have been monster if he didn't fumble the ball like 3 times in the first quarter, something ridiculous, going in for touchdowns too. So, he's got to be on there because I can't think that that's going to happen again, and they really rely on him and they feed him in games like this. So he's going to be probably my 3rd ranked back. I like Javorius Allen. I mean, look, these guys, those top, you can't even really rank them.
Yeah,
you just say what fits. What can I fit on there? And I'll find a way to use them all on different teams because they're all have this capability of going for 200 yards and multiple touchdowns. And it's hard to pinpoint down which one is going to get it done this week, but they're all in play and they're all at the top of the list. So you just take them all and whatever you can fit on your team.
Yeah, I think the one that stands out most on DraftKings is Conner because he's only 6,600, but. I think that you're right on everybody else is just, whatever fits. Maybe Javorius Allen is the least owned, and I think he's somebody against Washington State who should have a pretty big week here. I expect them to kind of feed him the ball. So let's move down a few slots and look at some other guys. What's your thoughts on Nick Chubb this week? He's been unbelievable as the lead back. It's going to happen again. 30 and 38 carries. The last 2 weeks, 345 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's been a monster, but he gets a Florida team here, and looking at this total real quick, I think we're going to be sitting at 48 right now, opened at 54, so a really low total. I think for me, this is the week to jump off of Nick Chubb.
The volume is good. The price tag rose a little bit too much for my liking. Out of that total, though, it's all supposed to be Georgia. They're favored by more than 2 touchdowns, so they're up over 30 as far as they're in the 32 range as far as their personal team total. If you like volume and you like a certain number of carries that you know you're going to get, then that's probably going to be one of your guys. He's going to get those 35 carries again. Florida seems to me like they're a team that's fallen apart. Now, I wouldn't blame anybody if they wanted to save, let's say, a couple of grand off of Abdullah and go with Chubb. I mean, you're going to get a lot of volume. You're going to get a team that's fallen apart. You're going to be at home, so I can't hate on it. He's a little bit too much for me on FanDuel. Because if I could save $1,000 on FanDuel and go with a guy who I think is going to have a nice week, especially in GPPs, is Perine from Oklahoma. And I think GPP is the operative word because Keith Ford is supposed to maybe be back. And I think all that does is going to drive people away from Perine when, in fact, I don't think Ford is going to be a factor at all. And they're going to play Iowa State, who's one of the worst in the nation against the run. And the guy's already shown, like his first game against West Virginia, he's already shown he's got 4 touchdown capability. So I'm all over on Perine for a pretty decent price in GPPs.
Is it Perine or is it Perine?
The guys on TV say Perine, so I go Perine, man.
I don't know. I think Samaje Perine sounds better. He needs to change the enunciation of that. I'm with you, and we can't neglect Duke Johnson as well. I mean, I think Duke Johnson over Nick Chubb for me. North Carolina has been abysmal versus the run. He got 29 carries last week, and just looked awesome. And he's been great every week. Look at his yards per carry. Just and a lot of those situations, it's kind of been blowouts, and they've been giving the ball in the goal line to Gus Edwards a little bit, but he should have a big day. That line for Miami is really good, and I think that he makes. I think he's almost on par with those other guys that we talked about in the beginning. Okay, a few other guys that stand out. Who do you like better, Robert Lowe of Texas State or Larry Rose III of New Mexico State?
Just from my personal experience this year, I would say Robert Lowe. I know Robert Lowe had that one game where he was a scratch and he messed everybody up, but other than that, guy's been a lot more consistent in my eyes than Larry Rose. I feel like I'm taking a bigger chance if I go Larry Rose. Even though the matchups are slightly in favor of Rose, I'd still go with Lowe because, I've seen his workload here recently, and it's pretty good.
Are you okay with Justin Jackson this week? He's $6K on FanDuel, $5,100 on DraftKings. And this kid for Northwestern has really looked the part, over 100 yards in 3 consecutive games, and getting the volume you like to see. He looks like a good value.
He's got a great price on him, and he's going to get those carries, and I don't see why. If you're in that range and you want to go down and not take 2 stud backs, he's going to be one of the first guys I'd look at as a value back. Sure.
Any other really low-dollar value backs that might?
I'll tell you what, on FanDuel, the guy I'm looking at is, if he's playing and healthy, is Lavon Coleman for Washington, because Colorado is their numbers are arguably the worst in the nation against the run, basically. And if Coleman doesn't play, that'd be great because I really want to have Shaq Thompson on there, and Shaq Thompson will be the guy who gets all the carries if Coleman doesn't play. So, but if they say Coleman's starting, Shaq Thompson will go back to defense. You don't have to worry about him, and Coleman will be the guy. So that situation, though, one of those Washington running backs is going to have a big game because the quarterback is injured, and the backup quarterback played last week, and he was atrocious.
Yeah, Miles might be back in this one. It's kind of iffy at this point in time, but you're right. That backup quarterback is no good. Troy Williams? Not so hot. But yeah, Shaq Thompson, I'm glad that they've got him in the player pool. He is a guy who came over from defense, and Pretty good numbers there. 21 for 98. That was a mess of a game too. I mean, both of these defenses knew that nobody was going to throw the football because there was like gale force winds going on. So I fully expect Thompson, especially if Miles is back, to kind of have an even bigger game. But we got to keep our eye out on that. Okay, that kind of handles the early running backs. We're going to move right along to wide receivers here in the early session. And in that same game, Nelson Spruce has come back down to earth, boys. I mean, look at this. Started out like gangbusters, and over the last 3 weeks, he's only been over 6 receptions one of those times. Has not been over 70 yards, and has only 1 touchdown. Is this the bounce back week for Nelson Spruce, or is the guy that we saw the last 3 weeks the real Nelson Spruce? What's your take on him? Because his price is starting to come down a little.
Washington has not been a pushover on defense lately, and but I got to think that Spruce is going to have a decent game this week. I kind of blame the bad games in the recent stretch on fairly tough competition. A couple of those games were really, really tough, really locked down cornerbacks that were stuck on him. So if he's going to bounce back, this will be the week. I mean, if he can't get it done against Washington, then I will tread extremely lightly moving forward. But I think this is a fairly good week for Spruce.
Hardy or White, again, I think you can take both of these guys. But for me, I'm actually would save the 700 on FanDuel at least and go Antoine Goodley. I think both he and Coleman, if you wanted to double up these guys, I think it's a GPP move. We've seen it pay off in the past. A few weeks ago when Petty went nuts, if you had both these guys on the team, you probably cashed a whole bunch of money that day. We're expecting them to kind of put a hurting on them. Now, Coleman's at 6,800. The Goodley's 83. Bringing in salaries into the equation, do you give the edge to Coleman, or do you think Goodley's the more sure thing this week?
Goodley, he's the safer option. Coleman, super upside, man. He's a GPP guy for sure. I think if you want to play it safe, you go Goodley. You mentioned the first two. You mentioned Hardy and White. Why? That's not for me. That's not even a contest. I take Hardy all day this week. I think East Carolina's in for a big game, and White. Yeah, I had him last week. I watched the game. I'm not saying they caught on to what West Virginia does, but finally somebody was smart enough to double down on White, and they really held him in check, and I wouldn't be surprised if TCU did the same thing.
Well, at least I got a game plan on him for sure this week. A few other names to look at. Nelson Aguilar, I like him this week. That should be a high-scoring affair against Washington State. If the Cougs start to get going offensively, you're going to see USC really air it out. He's their number 1 wide receiver, 7,700 over on FanDuel. DraftKings, he is sitting at a little bit better salary, 6,700. So definitely put him on your list. West Virginia do decide to double him or double White. He's the one who's going to kind of get the advantage. Now, what's your take on Texas A&M's wideouts? Because this is one thing I've noticed. DraftKings this week priced them all up. They are expensive over there. But on FanDuel, you can get almost anybody you want from this A&M receiving core for about $6K or less. And obviously, I can see the teams right now. Kyle Allen and cheap A&M wide receiver, a couple of stud running backs, and boom, you're kind of set. So I can see the lineup building going through my head and other people's head at the moment. But how do you rate these A&M wide receivers this week?
If I was going to rank them, the only one I'd say for sure that I would have number 1 is Kennedy, and that's even kind of a stretch right there. And Noyle's good, but basically I think even when Kenny Hill was in there, we could never pinpoint one A&M wide receiver. It was Ricky Seals-Jones sometimes. It was Edwin Pope sometimes, Kennedy, Noyle, and even Josh Reynolds. So there's 5 guys. There's no real reason for me to think that you have to handcuff them. In GPPs, it's a fine play, but that I just mentioned 5 guys. So you're basically taking a 1 in 5 shot that you're going to, there's a 4 in 5 chance that you're going to destroy your team by having a really bad wide receiver on there in GPPs. I don't think it's necessarily you have to handcuff the quarterback to anybody if you don't want to. They got 5 targets. I'm really not enthused about any of them.
Yeah, I think I like Reynolds best, but you make definitely good points. You certainly don't have to in that offense with how many people they have to throw the ball to. You know who's trolling me this season? Jamison Crowder, and you know who's making it even worse is DraftKings. Below 5K, who would have thought that he and Deontay Greenberry would be like under 5K at this point in the season? But I think they both are, or at least darn close to it. Your thoughts on these guys as flyers, or are we just checked out on them?
I've checked out, man. I just can't do it no more. The price keeps dropping on Crowder. Well, both of them, but especially Crowder because I keep rostering him in. Just waiting for that explosive breakout game. It just hasn't happened yet. Pitts is not a slouch on defense, and so I just don't know if it's even worth it. There's value to be had elsewhere, and I mean, listen, this might be the game. We can say this with a lot of guys, but this might be the game he blows up for his 10 receptions, which eventually he will have 10 receptions, 150 yards, and a couple touchdowns. But, it's right now you're playing Russian roulette, to put it, comes this week.
Yeah, and he's somebody, Pittsburgh's got one of the better pass defenses out there, but he did go for 8 for, I think, 89 or 99 last week, so he was pretty darn decent for that salary. So I definitely think he's a GPP play over there on DraftKings. And the problem you're running into as well is that it's a tighter cap, and he just kind of stands out as a potential value that has a lot of upside this week. So I think he'll be popular in tournaments, or at least I'll have some exposure to him in tournaments. I know you're not interested in the quarterback Gardner, but what about Funchess at wideout?
His success and failure is like almost directly tied to Gardner, but he's a little bit safer than Gardner. His price is dropping enough to where I could see rostering him, and yeah, this might be a good game for him. Like I said, Gardner's just not being good, and I don't know what the problem is if he's checked out or whatever, but you're kind of tied. You're kind of a little bit handcuffed. I wouldn't expect a huge game out of Funchess, but he's got the ability to put up some decent numbers. The price tag is what makes me even remotely consider him. It's dropped down enough to where you're saving a little bit of money from what you would have. Like in week 3, you would have said Funchess would have been one of the highest salary receivers by this week, but he's actually going backwards. So you're saving a little bit of money.
Just remember what this game yielded last year?
Well, listen, remember this time last year we were looking at Gardner saying, wow, this guy's just, he's an awesome quarterback. He runs, he passes, he does. He was putting up fantasy numbers. He hasn't put up like really good fantasy numbers maybe one time in the last 15 games.
Yeah,
it's amazing. It's amazing how much he fell off. And he's dragging Funchess down with him.
I think maybe the most underrated wide receiver, Sterling Shepard at Oklahoma. Man, this guy does it week in, week out. Really went nuts this past week. 15 for 197 and 1. He's still below 8K on FanDuel this week, so I think you need some exposure to him. I've seen and heard a lot of people interested in Iowa State this week. Oklahoma's defense certainly hasn't been good, but this is Iowa State we're talking about, and it seems to me like Allen Lazard is at least somebody to put on your list. 5,400 on FanDuel, 8 for 96 and a touch, 8 for 88 and a touch the last 2 weeks. What's your feeling on Iowa State, and is Lazard on your list of potential plays this week?
He's on the list of potential plays. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to fit him in there. Just depends on how you want to do it, but he's on the list because Oklahoma was a slightly overrated on defense earlier in the year, and now they've kind of been exposed. And this guy's a young guy. He's a freshman, and he's as big of a recruit as they've maybe ever had at Iowa State. It's been a long time. So he's got this pedigree from high school, and he's actually had some really nice games this year. They've had a little bit of time now to work with him, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has a really kind of a blow-up game against Oklahoma. You just never know. Sam Richardson's coming around as a good quarterback.
Yeah, I don't know. Against Oklahoma, maybe.
Well, I'm not saying play Sam Richardson, but I'm saying he's progressed as a quarterback real nicely, and he's taken Lazard, and we'll get into E.J. Bibbs, I'm sure, at tight end, but he's taken those two guys and made them pretty decent plays. 4
touchdowns the last 2 weeks by this wide receiver. Who am I talking about?
Well, that's pretty Dotson.
There you go, Josh Doctson, 6,200. Did come out a little bit injured last game, but it seems supposedly a miraculous, comeback. I'm nervous about it. I think he's somebody I don't want a piece of this week because I think West Virginia's pass defense is a little bit better than people think. B, you've got that injury still kind of looming. You never know in college football. There's a whole bunch of games that can be played here with coaches and the media and so forth. And then lastly, I think that, here's a guy who could easily just be over-owned. He's been huge the last 2 weeks. Everybody wants a piece of TCU now. And I don't want to go along with the herd. So for me, I think I'm all out on Josh Doctson this week.
Well, the thing is, if he's over-owned, it'll be because for some reason his price just isn't climbing enough, especially on FanDuel. I mean, he's still sitting at 6,200 which is a pretty darn low salary for a guy who's established himself as the clear number one wide receiver in that offense. Going against, I know that West Virginia has a decent pass defense. They've been better lately. But, geez, TCU is still projected to score 40 points in a 74 over-under. That's tough, to fade completely something like that. If you're going to play Boykin and you're going to handcuff him, I could see using a couple of Dotsons and a couple of Listenbys or even Gray. The kid Gray's pretty good too. You could take your pick, and if you want to be contrarian, you go with the other guys. Listenby would be a good one but it wouldn't surprise. I don't know if I'm going to squeeze Dotson in there, but it wouldn't surprise me if we're looking at Dotson with another 2 touchdowns after this week. He's the number one guy.
Yeah, Listenby, I think, is a good alternative if you want exposure to that game. Okay, tight ends, we like E.J. Bibbs, and, he's going against Oklahoma. He's legit. I think Clive Walford's going to have a bounce-back game. Did nothing last go-around. Gets UNC today. Love the number on DraftKings. 43 on FanDuel. A little bit more than I like to spend on tight end, but he's got, I think, an ability to score a touchdown, get you 50 yards. This week. Any punts real quick for people?
Arneson got he got a touchdown call back last week, so that just shows me at least they're going to him in the red zone.
Yeah, always a good option there for Wisconsin. Okay, let's move to the late slate, and boy, I talked about this in the quarterback play. The quarterback options are just immense. Barrett, Prescott, Mariota, Hundley, Nick Marshall, Solomon. Man, it just goes on and on and on. Everett Golson's another one that you got to look at against Navy. Honestly, folks, pay up for quarterback in the late slate because there's no reason not to get, I think, both, 2 of these studs on your team, mixing and matching them because it's tough to pick out which ones. So I'm going to ask you this. Instead of your favorite, who is your least favorite out of all these big-name, high-priced quarterbacks this week in the late slate?
Oh, man. It would be Mariota. It would be Mariota because of the matchup, even though, I just don't want to pay that much for that kind of a matchup. But, we've seen him do it before. But the other guys, there's just no weakness in the other guys, pretty much. Those games are just tight, man. They're good competition. A lot of them should be fairly close. But, I give the edge to Mariota as the lower seed, lowering him down on the rankings because of the matchup. The other guys just don't have any flaws.
Yeah, I'm actually checking out on J.T. Barrett this week. I know it's Illinois, but are you worried about the injury situation here? Because I am. He came out banged up, and I think he's going to play fine. I think he'll, obviously be out there, but I think that they could establish more of a running game. I think they're going to probably not use him as a runner very much because they don't want him to obviously aggravate that injury. And I think that takes away one of his biggest assets, or biggest weapons this week. So I don't see myself paying up for J.T. Barrett pretty much in any circumstance this week because of that.
He'd be the guy that I would rank right ahead of Mariota. And even with the injury, we don't know exactly what's going on there, but he will play, and they are projected to score nearly 50 points. So he'll get something out of that. That's why I put him above Mariota because they've got the highest projection of any team on the board for that slate of games. They're at almost 50 at home against a really bad defense, and Urban Meyer will rub it in on him, and he won't pull him out for maybe mid fourth quarter when they've already scored 60 points or something, he'll pull them out. But you know, he is what it is. There's just so many options. You know, yeah,
so I
you
mean,
fade those
1,100
two.
more than Hundley. I don't know.
Well,
That
Hundley's more than he is on FanDuel.
yeah.
So you kind of, if you want to put your quarterbacks side by side and pick out which side is the better value to take that, you could use, a plethora of quarterbacks and just take the best value on each side, which is what I like to do anyway.
I do think Goldson will be under-owned against Navy. He's somebody who should do really well in this matchup. Big favorites. Notre Dame, again, another one of these one-loss teams that needs to kind of put together, dominating performances to impress this committee. So I expect good things from him. And then a new Solomon, really like him this week. He gets a matchup versus UCLA, and that should be a shootout both ways. One of the highest totals on the week. So look for those guys to obviously, be top options. All right, let's scroll down just a little bit. Cal has been dreadful this season. But have they been dreadful enough to use Sean Mannion, who's been about as mediocre as you could basically find as a starting quarterback in the Pac-12?
Yeah, the Mannion is the Pac-12 version of Devin Gardner, basically, and we don't know what happened to him, but he's disappeared and doesn't look like he's coming back. With the guy, especially you're looking at FanDuel and 7,200. That's just I'll pay the little bit extra and go for Golson or any of those guys. That's not even a question mark over there on FanDuel. So no.
Yeah, FanDuel, it's a ridiculous salary. Even on DraftKings, 7K is too much. So I think we'll fade Cal defense this week, or I don't know if that's fading them, but basically not go against them. A few other guys to consider. Give me some other names you like. Low to middle tier here this week.
Low tier, which I can say the names because they're going to play and their options, but they're not recommended when you have the good quarterbacks on the tab. But Joe Gray, San Jose State, gets a real nice matchup with Colorado State. Jamil Showers from UTEP plays a really bad Southern Miss team. I mean, if somehow Davis Webb ends up being out of that game because he was injured last game, Patrick Mahomes is the backup quarterback. Super cheap. He'd be minimum salary. And these are just low. Nick Mullins from Southern Miss against UTEP. That's not a bad play. But these guys right here, you're kind of taking your team and it's a dart throw, man. Whenever you have Dak Prescott, Hundley, Marshall, and those guys on the board, I don't know if you could go that route and go super cheap in the late slate.
Yeah, the Zach Greenlee for Fresno, maybe on DraftKings at 4K. He's getting the start this week, so he's a min salary at home against Wyoming. So if you just want to maybe get one of those big QBs and punt the other spot, he could be somebody to consider. But honestly, I'm just going to be using those top guys, I think, in the late slate. Running back wise, let's move on to it. And again, not as much on the high end really standing out for us here. I guess we can look at the top end guys. You got Robinson, you've got Pumphrey, you've got Booker, you've got DJ Foster, Waller. Honestly, I don't think I'm going to use many of them at all on DraftKings this week for the simple reason of the salary cap is pretty tight, and it gets a lot tighter when you're using a couple of 8.5, 9K QBs. So I'm kind of all out on them, but I'd say Devontae Booker against Arizona State is one guy that I like a little bit of exposure to. What's your thoughts?
Booker's been hot lately. He's been pretty impressive. But the price is rising. I can understand playing him in that same category. You could go Josh Robinson though on FanDuel. Booker's 300 more than Robinson. On FanDuel, I'd rather have Robinson. Let's put it like that. He had one really awesome game week and a half ago, and he came back last week and did pretty good too, man. He got a lot of garbage time yardage there at the end of that game when they were making their comeback. So it makes that stat line look a little bit better than it was, but he's in play. But at that price, I mean, if I'm getting two big quarterbacks, you're going to have to go cheap on running back is what it comes down to.
Yeah. Ezekiel Elliott's one kind of mid-tier guy I like because I think Ohio State's going to put up some big numbers. So he's 6,800 on DraftKings. I think he might be 7K over on FanDuel, so it's going to be a little bit tougher to roster him there. A few other guys to consider here, Shop. Terrace Jones-Grigsby and Nick Wilson, do you have any clarity on this situation? These
I mean,
guys?
if I was going to lean somewhere, it'd be Grigsby. But it might be a situation just best to avoid because the salaries aren't like rock bottom or anything like that. And they could split carries. And, there's all kinds of things that could happen. One could be injured and not play, and the other one would be a fine play, but you wouldn't really know it because they're both a little bit banged up. They could both play and split carries, and considering that their price isn't like anything incredibly reduced, I'd probably avoid that situation. But if I was going to lean one way, and I do think it's going to be a high-scoring game, if I was going to lean some way, it'd be Jones-Grigsby.
All right, let's continue on here. A few other guys to look at in this late slate. Oh, I lost it. Well, let's see. Give me some other names while I bring up my player pool here.
One guy I'm looking at is Ralph Webb for Vanderbilt versus Old Dominion. Old Dominion doesn't have a good defense. Ralph Webb seems to be the guy who's the number one running back over there. Vanderbilt, man, they're just pathetic this year. But if they're going to win a game from this point forward, this might be their only chance. So I'd go Ralph Webb. Another guy who I think is a sneaky play this week, especially with the injury situation to the quarterback, is DeAndre Washington for Texas Tech. It's not a great matchup, but I don't think the matchup matters too much in this offense because they're going to spread Texas out so much. And if the quarterback is banged up, or even if it's the second string quarterback, I think you'll see a lot more emphasis on the running game. And DeAndre Washington's put up some incredible yards per carry average this year. So if they beat him 20 or 25 times, he could actually have a nice game, and his price is super reduced all over the place. Men's salary, if you were just going to try to punt the position and go way, way low, I don't have a problem giving a shot at Don Jackson for Nevada against San Diego State. I think Nevada's going to put up some points, and it's just about time for the running back to get up in that action because Fajardo, whatever it is, he's been taking like all the running touchdowns recently, and I think he's going to, give a little back now to the running backs this week. It's just about that time.
All right, I'm looking on DraftKings. A lot of names here under 5K, which kind of standing out to me. Ray Lowry, I talked about him last week for ODU. Boy, did he ever live up to that hype. So hopefully you used him. He gets Vanderbilt. Not a bad play there. But what's your take on these guys? You got Byron Marshall against Stanford at 4,800. Curtis Artis-Payne against Ole Miss at 4,700. Honestly, I think these guys are probably 7K running backs or / wide receivers for Marshall, but he's a running back this week on DraftKings. But they are facing two of the best defenses in Stanford and Ole Miss. So do we just say the matchup's not good, or do we say these guys are underpriced? It doesn't take that much to pay them off. They're going to get action. Who do you like better between them, and your thoughts on those guys who feel underpriced to me?
With Marshall, I don't think the matchup matters because he's just a really odd player that they put all over the place, and they throw him the ball, and he's a mismatch. He's a matchup nightmare. So I'm not worried about the matchup with Stanford there. It just be, do you want to roster him? He's fairly inconsistent, but he does have potential to have big games. So it's just kind of your risk tolerance there. I don't have a problem with Marshall. Cameron Artis-Payne he's got a cheap salary, but he's a little bit scary for me this week because I think this is a Nick Marshall type week in these big games like this that mean a lot. Nick Marshall takes a lot of action away from Cameron Artis-Payne. And when I look at this game from last year, it was Nick Marshall who did all the damage, who did most of the damage on the ground, and Trey Mason kind of took a backseat to Marshall last year. I can kind of see the same thing playing out here this year where it's Nick Marshall and a little bit of the running back, but mainly Nick Marshall.
I love Byron Marshall this week for that price because he's going to catch the ball 5 times. And you know what? I watched that game a good bit last week, and they used him more in the running back spot than they have all season long. And I don't think that they're going to get away from Royce Freeman, who in his own right is pretty underpriced, to be honest with you. But I do think that I'll be willing to kind of give him a shot. Is Losefa back? I don't think he's back yet. I think he's gone for at least one more week out there for Hawaii. So you could look to Stephen Lakalaka Pretty good price there and a great name to say, so you get excited every time he scores a touchdown. And there you go. That's the value there at running back. Let's move on to wideout here. Chop, just some news. Drez Anderson out for Utah. He's going to be gone for the year. I think Kenneth Scott might get a little bit of a bump there against Arizona State, so definitely don't roster Drez Anderson, whatever you do. Hunter Sharp basically sucked last week for me, Chop. He was a roster killer. I had him a whole lot, and you know what? You kind of warned me saying, I don't know about this third-string quarterback, but he's still pretty cheap again there over on FanDuel, so I don't know if I'll go back to the well or not.
You don't do it, man. Don't do it. Not only is the third-string quarterback bad, now he got injured. Now they're down to their fourth-string guy. So he's not even on my radar this week. There's just no way, man. Hunter Sharp is off my radar.
Off the radar. I like it. Okay, Rashard Higgins is a total stud, but tough to roster him with these big quarterbacks, so I think he is kind of a fade for me. Tyler Lockett or Caleb Jones this week? Who do you prefer?
Ooh, that's a tough one because Caleb Jones has really established himself as the number one guy in that offense. That Arizona UCLA total is a full 20 points higher than Kansas State, Oklahoma State. That's pretty odd, but it's a full 20 points higher. I think just for sheer volume of a shootout, I might have to lean Caleb Jones.
Yeah, I really like both these guys, especially on DraftKings. On FanDuel, Lockett's got a price that'll make him lesser owned. And look at what Oklahoma State has done this year against wide receivers. It hasn't been very pretty for Oklahoma State. So I think Lockett will have a big game, and I think he's a contrarian play over on FanDuel if you can work him in. Okay, a few other names for us. Jordan Payton I like this week for UCLA. Again, you don't need a handcuff for Brett Hundley, but if you want one, he is somebody to consider. Any desire to give your boy Ty Montgomery some run? You know, there's going to be an up-tempo game here for Stanford. It's probably Oregon, and I think his salary is about as low as we've seen in a while.
Yeah, I was debating that earlier of whether I want to put him on some teams, and then I decided I think it might be a good idea to throw him in there. He's they're going to have to score the ball somehow. I think there's going to be some points in the game. It's hard to pinpoint where it's going to come from, but we know it's not going to come from the Stanford running game, that's for sure, because they don't have a running back to save their lives. So they'll find a way to get him the ball. If this is one of those classic Stanford-Oregon shootouts, if it turns into that, you're going to want a little piece of Ty Montgomery because you just never know what might happen.
Hasn't scored a touchdown in 4 weeks, so definitely due for one. He's due. Tyler Winston, San Jose State. I love him.
You like him? I mean,
I like him. I mean, he's been down the last few weeks. I mean, since they've kind of changed quarterbacks, he hasn't had that ridiculous kind of numbers that he was putting up a little bit earlier. But I still think he's underpriced. I mean, under $5K on DraftKings, and I think he's under $6K on FanDuel. It's hard to upside with Winston going against Colorado State at home.
No, I looked at his numbers. He seems like a really solid play. He's got a pretty good price tag, and he'll be on some of my DraftKings teams for sure.
What Notre Dame wide receiver do you want? Is it Fuller, who's 72 on DraftKings?
Fuller, you don't even got
David Robinson's son looked awesome last game.
He did, but Fuller's the number one guy. The one game thing done. I got to see it more than once. All year long I've been watching Fuller, and he's really good, man. And he's really the guy that Golson looks to quite a bit, man, especially down in the end zone. Fuller's my number one guy. I mean, listen, if you're going to play in a GPP and you want to change things up and you want to, it's a classic thing of fade the number one guy and go with the number two and hope he blows up, and then you're way ahead of the field. That's what Robinson is. But if you're doing a cash game and you need, I need the odds-on favorite to catch most of Golson's passes, it's going to be Fuller.
I think that Devin Allen's somebody you want to look at here at 3,900 on DraftKings, maybe not on FanDuel. I know it's not a great matchup, and the numbers for him have been down, but you know what? I watched, again, this game with Oregon's game the last few weeks, and they're definitely trying to get him the ball, and a lot of these times it's just Mariota just missing him or a penalty calling something back, but they're giving him looks in the red zone as well, so don't kind of write off Allen. I think you can buy low on him in this matchup. Give me a few other names before we wrap this up and get to tight ends and say
lower dollar. I'll go lower dollar. Lucky Whitehead from Florida Atlantic against UAB. He had a pretty good game last week. After looked at some of his game logs and they were pretty good, and he was on the schedule last week, so I played him a little bit and he had a good game. So I went, and he's really cheap actually now. Eric Judge is a men's salary guy, so you're kind of taking your fate in your own hands there with him. But Eric Judge from San Diego State is the #1 guy out there going against Nevada. We could have some points in that game. I wouldn't like cash game Eric Judge, but he's a GPP guy. You mentioned most of them. I mean, the low dollar, there's just not too many low dollar guys. Zach Pascal's salary has dropped after Antonio Vaughn is catching everything the last couple weeks. But if we go back to the first 4 or 5 weeks of the year, Pascal and Vaughn were nearly equals. So the significant price drop in Zach Pascal makes him a pretty darn good play this week for Old Dominion if you want to fade Antonio Vaughn.
I think you hit up on some pretty solid points there, Mr. Head Chopper. Let's go to tight end here, and in the late slate, Stephen Show of Vanderbilt against ODU. I think he's got a pretty good matchup there. Hunter Henry and A.J. Derby against Mississippi State. That's a team that got exposed last week with the pass a good bit, so you might be able to find some value in their top pass catchers, and I think they are the tight ends. Connor Hamlet versus Cal, maybe? Maybe this is the week for him, Chop?
Maybe, but boy, he's on that Sean Mannion death train, man. They can't get it going, right? I mean, these were some good players last year, and they just fell off this year. And so yeah, he's at his salary right now. He's definitely playable. So, 3,100, you can do a lot worse. I give you a couple other guys that I was kind of. You mentioned the good ones already, but Billy Freeman, San Jose State, pretty decent tight end, got some potential. So I wouldn't, he's in the mix. A guy from UAB called Kennard Backman, he's not bad. He's right. If you're talking about 3,100 and below on FanDuel, you're taking a shot in the dark anyway. So none of these guys are like trustworthy. If there's one guy and you really wanted to pay up and say I think he's going to produce, and I'm not going to spend this much on a tight end though, but it's Farrell Brown from Oregon. He's almost like another wide receiver. But that's a pretty expensive salary. Otherwise, you're throwing darts.
Yeah, DraftKings definitely priced down guys against the Stanford D, so he's affordable over there. But on FanDuel, you're right.
Yeah.
You pay a pretty penny for him. Well, that's going to do it for us tonight on College Football After Dark. We certainly are glad you joined us here on the show, and know that you can continue to get great content here, college football-wise, on Roto Grinders through our incentives. Lots of great free columns. And on Saturday morning, you'll get STL Cardinals and EMAC as they will talk with you from 10:30 to 11:30. My boy Head Chopper's in the expert chat. Again, another perk for being an incentives member is you get to ask him questions for an hour before tip-off on Saturday morning. So that's what we got going on. But for my buddy Head Chopper, I'm Dan Bach. Good luck in all your college games this week, and we will see ya.